Absolution. In the max speed, it both defines as a full rep. One to the street is set. Okay. Now I can go back to yes.
You can zoom out. Look at the stream from here from yesterday.
Let's start the tape on that.
Other way in for no,
Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right, let's get started. Any questions? Any questions that everybody would want to hear the answer to?
Do you have the recipe for that meat last?
Oh, man. You know, there was a little bit left over, and I brought it home, and my dog was very happy. No, I don't have the recipe for that meat. All right, welcome back to the 15th Annual Conference for Law School Computing. Got some housekeeping stuff to take care of. One room change. It's tomorrow. I haven't even told Chris Blessett. Chris, your session 3-Ring Circus, Barnum and Bailey's Guide to Law School Webcasting, great title, huh? Is not going to be in room C40, it's going to be in room 510. So on your things, it's just sliding over one column there. All right? I think that's about the only, no, I've got a couple of other things. Yes, I forgot to thank, more specifically, Chicago Kent for their sponsorship. I think I might have thanked them last night. But I wanted to make sure that I made that explicit, that Chicago Kent is a co-sponsor of this conference, and we really appreciate them hosting us, not only for the first 8 or 9 years of the conference, but letting us come back every couple of years. Thanks, Chicago Kent. All right. I also wanted to thank all of our corporate sponsors. What I'd like you to do is do me a favor. Sometime during one of the breaks, spend 5 or 10 minutes and go visit our corporate sponsors. It's more than just justification for them being there. They've actually always got new things going on, new technologies, new ideas, and they love feedback. At least I would hope they would love feedback. And they send us letters and emails that we throw out or ignore because the flood of information is so heavy that it's hard to find out what's going on or it's hard for us to filter. Well, this is a chance to go and actually see something, talk to them about it, ask them questions, give them feedback. And it's a rare opportunity, and so you should avail yourselves of it. But I wanted to say thank you to all of our corporate sponsors. Evaluations. Boy, I love this. All right, we're going to do something really simple for evaluations. Everybody got one of these, which is the agenda. Instead of doing a special form and killing more trees, what I'd like you to do for evaluations is this. If you attended a session, circle it, and write a number between 1 and 5. 1 being, well, it wasn't that good, and 5 being fantastic, wonderful. All right? On the back, write any comments you might have referring to either specific speakers, sessions, or anything about the conference. Here's the type of feedback I look for. 1 is things we shouldn't do that we did. In other words, you did this, don't do that again. The second thing is things that we do that we should do again. You did this, keep doing it. All right? And the third one is something like, I wish there was a session on. All right? Now, you don't have to depend on just the paper version. There's going to be boxes there, and you can fill this out for Thursday and tear it off and put it in the boxes. You could also send me a personal email with your ideas and suggestions. I do read every single one of them. I do often turn around and say, great, do you want to do that session? But you can say no. And because the conference, I don't know if you know, we don't like say, well, here's the sessions we want, now let's go find speakers. Rather, I say, here's some ideas for sessions, but you the public, you the technoids and Law Live and Law Prof, where I post these things on the web, then sort of pour in ideas. And there aren't many ideas that don't end up on the agenda. Sometimes they get moved or morphed or changed a little bit, but for the most part, it's spontaneously coming from the community, which is why the theme of this conference is so appropriate to how this conference runs, right? All right. You may have or may not have heard last night that next year we're at Nova Southeastern in Fort Lauderdale. And so the search begins for a good theme for next year's conference. And I've already got some ideas here, and I wanted to run them by you. Welcome to CALI world. All right, this is the one I really like. Law School IT, tropical storm, or just a bunch of bullhides? That's a good response. All right, this is the best one. Swamped with success? Anyhow, if you have ideas for a theme for next year's conference, let me know. All right. Our Friday keynote speaker is Robert Chassell, who is a founding member of the Free Software Foundation Board of Directors and has been involved in free software since 1985. Great. I'd like to introduce him and have him talk.
It works. Okay, and I just want to mention that the text to the speech in various formats, printable formats. Oh, I have to turn on my microphone. Can you hear me now? Now can you hear me? Yes. All I wanted to mention was that the text in a variety of renderings for printing, free forms for printing, HTML for your web page, info for listening and for good, efficient online looking is all available on rattlesnake.com. And Rattlesnake's where I grew up, which is why I got that website. And incidentally, I don't talk here about trust in this particular one, but I talk about it in one of the... Why did I just vanish? Oh, maybe there's... Ha 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 ha. Okay, that means I got to push that every so often. But I'll be doing it often enough in the talk. I don't talk about trust in this particular one, but it is on. There are two other things. There's one on the GPL, which is what we're going to have this afternoon, come with in your boxes and the things you carry. And there's a much longer thing which has trust stuff in it, which is just an example. Well, it's more than an example, but it is a good example. And I don't at all talk about metadata, which is important to lawyers, but it just happened not to be something that I talked about much. Okay, now I really want to go with the start and say that you know the definition of upgrade for computer programmers, which is that you take out the old bugs and you put in the new ones. And my hope is that this speech will be somewhat like that, except that I'm also hoping that you can fix the new bugs. I'm serious about that, actually. Now, because of technological advances, over the past few years, the old legal, technical, and social arrangements have become obsolete. That's a major theme. Because of technological advance, old legal, old technical, and old social arrangements have become obsolete. So we need to have new arrangements to help us promote civilization. And so the question here is, what can you do, especially for the creation of textbooks and casebooks? Now, the second thing is that as a practical matter, when you distribute your textbooks or your casebooks, when you have your students look at them, they should be in at least 3 different forms. One is, of course, the printed, well, one is the form for student driving. And for that, it means the students have to be able to listen. And that's something that people often don't think of. They think of the permanently blind, but they're a small and not very salient portion of the population. But the people who drive cars are situationally blind. And because they're situationally blind, and because it's technically easy and becomes easier and easier with your fancy telephone and whatnot, cell phone, then it becomes relevant to make that possible. A second thing, of course, is that you want the students to be able to work efficiently online. And the third is that, which is the traditional format, is the student reading and sitting in a chair and just reading a book or reading something like this. And those are the advantages to the student. Now the other set of advantages, and those are essentially technical, they're advantages to you as a teacher of law, as a librarian, or as a computer person, which is that you need to have the legal freedom, as well as a practical freedom, that you need to have the legal freedom to modify, distribute, archive, do whatever you want with the materials that you have. And we're going to talk about that. And then the third problem, by the way, which I don't mention here, but hopefully I'll mention the next one, is that we have the social hindrances, bad habits, corporations which have an older business model and haven't adapted to the present, haven't adapted to the technological stuff. So, I want to talk about the outline of the talk, which is somewhat of a repeat of what I just said. First, I'm going to talk about the settlement of disputes and the familiar but abstract nature of law, just to sort of be familiar. Then I'm going to talk about a major theme, which is the lowering costs. This is a technological advance. The lowering cost of information creation and reduplication has made the old laws obsolete. Then I'm going to do a brief discussion on metaphor, and there's a reason for that, which is that the metaphor, everybody knows what property is, but we've metaphorically extended, and the question is it been a useful metaphorical extension? And then I'm going to talk also about the decentralized planning mechanism of the United States Constitution, which is what gives the basis for the law. And by the way, there are two reasons for this. One is, as I said, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The second is that the economics inherent in our Constitution provides for progress. Then I mentioned, by the way, that this has all happened before. 100 years ago, there were changes, there were technological advances, and there were new laws. And then I'm going to jump to the present and talk in more detail about a legal tool that solved the problem for software. And then I'm going to talk about another one which solved the problem for software documentation, which can be extended either as is or with a little bit of additions to documentation for law, for writing textbooks, for writing casebooks. And then I'm finally going to point out that there are the hindrances. Well, first to start, we all know we need a reliable, quick, and honest legal system, which we vaguely have in the United States. It may not be as quick as you'd like, and there are some questions about its honesty for politically sensitive cases, but in most cases it works well enough. And it must work with strangers. And there are places that I've been to, like in Asia, that the legal systems don't work with strangers, and it doesn't work with people who don't have connections. And for most people, time is valuable, which means that your judgments must be fairly quick. Having legal cases that stretch out is a form of attack by the richer and more patient people against the ordinary people. And thirdly, of course, most people are honest and moral, but not everybody. And it's easier if your lawyers and such are honest, even though the system just has to live honesty. Now I want to talk about the abstract and the familiar. Basically, law is familiar, and it feels concrete, though, even though it is abstract. It is a bundle of rights and obligations, which is very abstract. But the way we're used to it, the way we have socialized, is that we start with a doll as a child. And the doll is very solid, and it's something that you can hold, you can throw, you can play with. I know my nephew, when he was very young, would play for hours with a doll that he could transform into different shapes. He's older now, but he isn't yet old enough to drive. But once he starts to drive, he will also have a concrete thing, which is a car. But if he parks in an illegal place, the car may get towed, in which case he either has to pay for it, pay the fine, or he loses the car. And all of a sudden at that point, the car ceases to be something that's concrete and becomes something that is solid. It becomes something that's abstract. It's not solid. It's not concrete. And so we have a shift from the very solid concrete car to the abstract nature of law. But it's very familiar. And it's so familiar it feels concrete even if it is an abstract thing. So, with time and familiarity, the concrete entity becomes, well, abstract property becomes a concrete entity. I got that reversed. And then what happens is that it applies not only to cars, not only to shirts, not only to ships, not only to shoes. It applies, for example, to property, as in property that you own, land, real estate. And in Massachusetts, which is what I know about, if you own land, you can decide what to plant. But you also have obligations. It's a mixture of rights and obligations. If you have the obligation to pay taxes, otherwise it gets taken away from you. And also in Massachusetts, and probably here, but I'm not sure, if you live in a rural area and you don't put up enough signs, you have to permit hunters to come on your land. And in contrast, this is, happens to be one of the things that in the early days, 250 years ago, was very significant, actually, because in Britain at that time you weren't allowed to cross English land, though you could in Scotland. Well, anyhow, so my point is that law is a mixture of obligations or freedoms, obligations and rights. And the rights become freedoms if they do it. Now, I should mention that most of the world is not like the United States or Western Europe. Most of the world is extra-legal. Which means that for you guys, if you're in schools, presumably anthropology has become central to your core because businesses have to deal with people who are overseas. Businesses are dealing more and more with strangers in a wider and wider range, so they're not in your same culture. And they often don't care about it, but I'm just mentioning that as a side effect. Now, this is the core. In the last 50 years, the cost of information has dropped. The cost of manufacturing new instances of it, which we don't call manufacturing anymore, we call copying. The cost of reduplication has dropped dramatically. Secondly, the initial cost, because of advantages which I'll get into, has also dropped down. And that's changed the basis of things. First, I want to talk about the lower incremental cost. It's less expensive to reduplicate information than 50 years ago. In particular, in a competitive free market, a full system on a CD costs between $1, and this is including marketing, selling, advertising, manufacturing, and distribution, costs between $1.50 and $2.50. It only is higher, and it often is higher, if you have an effective police enforcement system that says, we don't sell these things at their incremental cost, or what economists would call their marginal cost. And the incremental cost is the cost at which producing, distributing, marketing, advertising, all those things, and giving a little bit of profit, and maybe bribing a cop or whatever, a little bit, is the cost of things which tends to go to the price that the last individual is willing to pay. And it's a tendency, and it's a good one. Because what happens is that the buyers like to seek more, and the sellers have no choice because there's so many of them. And if you set up your institutional arrangements, the institutional arrangements will encourage many people to seek more. And the third reason, which affects geeks and people who read the economics and whatnot, which is a very small portion, there's actually a very good argument that there's a less waste of your effort and time if you have things at this price. If you have things at a higher price, then stuff is moved from the buyer to the seller. Resources are moved. And you have a less efficient allocation of resources. So first I want to talk about the lowered initial cost. Secondly I want to talk about that. It's obvious that it's cheaper to make 650 megabytes on a CD nowadays than it was 50 years ago. For one thing, you didn't have CDs. The initial costs are less expensive too, and there are three reasons. One is that it's much cheaper to work together at a distance now. Back in the early 1980s, I remember having a discussion, which I had to do by letter because we had to keep records of things, with people in the East Coast, the West Coast, St. Louis, and Canada. And so we did it by letter, and the problem was that the mail system was such that it took between a week and 3 weeks for stuff to go across the country. And the variance was just impossible. We did our business, but it was very slow. Nowadays, I can communicate very rapidly with people who are continents away and do it all the time. And in fact, in the last generation, what's happened is a new custom, which is that you don't respond to an email immediately because you want to think about it, so you delay answering for a little bit of time, like 24 hours, so you cool off. But there are other things where you don't have to worry about that. Like if you're writing source code. Then you can respond to it immediately. And so for that, it actually is easier if you have a version control system, so you can see who did what and when. And so you can distribute things readily and make branches and all that. So that is working together at a distance. It's also easier to gather information nowadays. In the old days, you had to go to a library and have a good reference library and have a good library conveniently available, or you had to go and talk to people. Now you can often get your information on the web. And there are people who even make an effort to make it readily available for you. And that makes some life a lot easier. And then the third is that we're richer. And this is something that yesterday's keynote speaker spoke about, that we're richer. But what he didn't mention was that 2,300 years ago, Aristotle actually talked about this, although I don't think Aristotle expected it. He talked about why we need an aristocracy. And he said, without an aristocracy, civilization cannot occur. because, he said, only those who do not work for material motivations would have the time to run a government, to create art, to write plays, and to write laws. Now, in Aristotle's day, a group that did not create material objects had to take them from other people. That was because of lack of technological development. And that's why Aristotle favored slavery. He said, until the shuttle could weave by itself, we will have slavery. Now, it happens that 2 millennia after Aristotle, inventors created automatic textile machines. So women and slaves and other people don't have to do that work. There's other work that they do, but they don't have to do that work. Now, it's still the case, as it was in Aristotle's time, that people need to eat to live. A minimal income is necessary. And people need to learn how to do things, so that schooling is necessary. And all of this costs time and money. So to follow Aristotle, people who create must have some form of income, and they must be educated. However, and this is the argument for volunteer work, and this was also mentioned yesterday morning, in addition to working for paid income, which great economists think is the only motivator, but truly isn't, many people also work for internal reasons, for the pleasure of doing what they're doing, or for external reasons, such as for developing reputation, or for gaining status, or simply because they're bored, or because they're expected to work. So which means, and this is coming back to accounting and managerial stuff, we find that people who write software documentation have become more like academics, novelists, artists, and the aristocrats of the past. In other words, they're going to be troublesome. But that's a useful thing to know. It also means that we know what knowledge workers need. We know that they're going to need enough pay. We know that they're going to need safety. That is to say, we need to reduce the generalized fear, in particular, that they're going to lose their income. Oh, I want to go back to this enough pay thing. People must survive. If you have an exciting and well-defined project, you may find volunteers, but don't count on them. You have to figure that the jobs that are going to cause you trouble are going to be boring and they're going to be ill-defined. So you're going to have to provide enough pay. That's the only way to get people. And as I said, safety, that you don't learn, that people don't fear their loss of their income, that the communications are inexpensive, that people don't fear that they're going to have somebody steal their work, even if it's legal, but it's felt to be immoral. That's a fairly important thing. It's important to provide appropriate tools for people, otherwise they just don't care to work with you. It's important to reduce the various costs of inputs, in particular that of hassle. We're talking about troublesome people, right? In addition, we know that people have to choose themselves to work on a project and be self-directed. Otherwise, they're going to be less productive. Because we're talking about people writing books, writing cases, or in my case, writing software. But for your case, it's people who write legal stuff. And you can have boring, dull people write very dull things and nobody pays any attention to them. And they don't do a very good job. The second thing is that if you're doing a project, it's actually useful to have it a form and design, otherwise people goes off in all directions. A third one is they have to have stable foundations if you want people to grow on it and add rooms and whatnot. Otherwise, again, it goes off in other directions. And of course, design must be modular, because if it's not, then there are too many interconnections and it's too complicated and everything falls apart. Basically, modules minimize the cooperation needed for small projects, and they make it possible to have large projects work together. So, we now get into legal implications. Potentially lower prices and potentially less hassle, which has all happened in the last half century. But the law can try to prevent the legal use of technological advance. And it's happened, you've seen that. But to go be effective, in other words, it doesn't matter if, say, 5 or 10% of your group break the law, because you can have people either chase after them, or there's just a small enough portion, it doesn't matter. But it does matter a lot if half or three-quarters of the people you're dealing with are not following your laws. So to be effective, law must go beyond police, judges, and lawyers. Effective law enforcement requires voluntary compliance. Effectively, it means you have to socialize kids in grade school or kindergarten. Because most people do what they think is right as adults, and they learn what is right when they're very young. So you have to socialize school children, you have to socialize college students. There's just no way to do it. Nothing else. I mean, that's what it means. And before I get to rivalrous and non-rivalrous, what I'm thinking in particular is that we're having a drop in the cost of the creation and reproduction, manufacture, replication of information, which to say means law school documents, casebooks, United States Code, and whatnot. And that's why this becomes a critical feature to you, because you're dealing with law, which is a low incremental but high initial cost topic. Now, I want to talk about rivalrous and non-rivalrous. A rivalrous thing is like a shirt or a shoe, which only one person can wear at a time. It is different from something that multiple people can wear at a time or can do at a time. For example, you can obey the law, you can obey the law, and even I can obey the law all at the same time, and we can all do it. It doesn't mean that if you obey the law, I'm forced to disobey it. It doesn't mean that. And that's a very big difference. It's a non-rivalrous. Your obeying the law does not rival my obeying the law. But you're wearing my shirt means I can't wear it. So that's a very big difference. But now metaphorically, we often extend the notion of rivalrous to non-rivalrous. Oh, I should mention the laws. I mentioned that. Law itself is non-rivalrous. But now, in particular, you extend the notion of non-rivalrous to rivalrous, and you have the concept of piracy, which is the second notion. And it has two parts. And there are people who tell us, first, that shirts and laws are identical. I can write that down. That's a really, it's a good point. Shirts and laws are identical. That's what they tell us. Which is not true, but they tell us that, because metaphorically they combine and extend it. And also they tell us that people who use the new technologies, especially children who use the new technologies, but others too, are very bad. In fact, they say they're so bad that the badness that they are like is equivalent to people who murder and rob. That's because they call these people pirates. And that's another metaphorical extension. And it's a very interesting one, because if you've heard of this, you have to think about it. Are the people who use new technology really that bad? Or is it that murder is not so bad? Or is it that the people who make up such a metaphor disregard actual murders? Well, all I can say is that a society that depends both on the security of its people and on a modern technology has to hate murder on the one hand, and on the other hand has to favor learning and the use of new technologies. Now let me leave murder aside and consider the fundamental U.S. law, which is the United States Constitution. In the United States of America, the purpose of copyrights and patents is to promote the progress of science and useful arts. In other words, it's a way in which the federal government is permitted to influence the economy through bounty giving. However, unlike a direct government subsidy, a copyright or patent doesn't take directly from government revenues, except through the cost of policing and courts. And these are seldom attributed to single works, whether it be a copyrighted work or whether it be something patented. So it provides very little direct cost to the government. Secondly, it's a benefit to the holders of the patent or the copyright only if other people are interested. And that's a critical and useful thing too. It means that only the things that are interested get the higher price that the restriction on the output of either a copyrighted book or a patented thing permits. So there's a trade-off here. You give up some of your rights to fair prices as a citizen of the United States, but the theory was that you gain new products. And the whole reason for it was because, it was thought to be very easy or very commonplace for crazy people to write books or to make inventions or whatnot. But what was expensive and difficult was to turn those books, to turn those inventions into something marketable, to invest in the manufacture of it, to market them, to advertise them, to distribute them, and to sell them. And so the whole idea behind all this was that, we are going to give a subsidy to the investors and to the publishers and whatnot in order to get more. But it's only going to last for a limited time because after they've got it going for a while, it'll keep on going at a fair market price. But nowadays, it's easier and less expensive to reduplicate some products. Not all of them, but some, in particular informational products. So people now are giving up more, even if the law stays the same, they're giving up more because of the technological change. Now, this has happened before. In the late 19th century, we had technological advances in steel making, flour making, oil refinery, railroads, actually several other things. For example, it cost a lot of money to build a railroad between New York City and Chicago. But to run 100 extra trains a year on that railroad didn't cost much until you really saturated the railroad, which hardly ever happened. So the incremental cost of operating a train from New York City to Chicago was low. But the initial setup cost, you had to build the railroad itself, was very high. And what happened then is that those companies that didn't have to pay the high initial costs, that is to say, the Erie in particular, which declared bankruptcy, had an advantage over the other companies. And so there was competitive bankruptcy. So what happened in 1885 was the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was at that time sought by the railroad companies' owners as a way to regulate themselves, because the way in which they were going to pay for their operations was to have a high enough price. Now, I'm going to skip this. Implications of high cost discovery. I'm just going to skip that because it's going to take too long. Now, we invented the GNU General Public License as a solution, as a legal solution to the problem of how do you stand tall, how do you have a government, law courts, lawyers, police act on your side when you run out of, what do we want to call it? When we create stuff that's inexpensive to reproduce. In this case it was software, but it works for other things too. And we did it, by the way, by using the very old law of copyright. But we had the challenge of legal theft, because that's what, and again it was said yesterday morning, that's what public domain does. It means that some public domain or VSD license, to take two big examples, mean that you can take somebody else's work, and take your work, for example, and change it, modify it, fix a bug, improve it slightly, whatever, and then prevent you from using that improvement. In other words, it's strictly a take situation, and you lose. And people get very upset when stuff is taken away and they can't use it again, or can't use slight improvements to it. So the GNU General Public License is able to do that. Now, a couple of things that established copyright law does. Jump ahead of myself. One is that it's the power to exclude, which means it implies the power to license. It implies the power to permit. And the point about that is that if you have the power to exclude, you can tell people that they violate the license. And it's not a contract. Contracts deals. A license is something where it's simply the imposition upon you of a government enforcement action. And that's what copyright is. So the GPL effectively comes out as a competitive free market license. Now, people often don't like competitive free markets. But in fact, as I said before, if you remove yourself to making your own decisions as much as you can, and you have a tendency to go towards the pricing that's fair, you will end up having a market where the price levels are good for buyers, as good as it can possibly be, where the competition will push the prices down, which won't necessarily be gratis, although if the price is really low, it will be, because we want to. It will be commercial. I've heard here other people speaking where they think of commercial must mean partial monopoly. But in fact, commercial only means you'd be like a lawyer who works with, of course, the freely redistributable free stuff, which is law. But he sells the services, and there are a couple of lawyers, at least, who make lots of money. Not all of them, of course. Most of them starve to death, but I'm sure. But lawyers work with a freely redistributable entity. And they work commercially. But now there's a problem. Many of the people who do things, like the steelmakers in the 1870s, and some people now, think in terms of what they produce, which is a low marginal cost, high initial cost. Probably high initial cost here, low marginal cost here. They think the only way to cover the low marginal costs is to raise the average price. And the only way you can do that is to restrict your output so that fewer people buy it, but those who buy it are willing to pay a lot more. And the only way to prevent other people then from coming in is to either hire thugs to beat them up, or to have a court system, which does it, but much more nicely. In fact, you don't even have to have thugs, you just have buddies. And it works out really nicely. And that was what the original point of the copyrights and patents was all about. That was in order to enable people to raise their prices by restricting others and do it through a court system, which is a very nice civilized way of doing it. The trouble, as I said, is that because of advances in the last 50 years, the cost of some things is dropping lower and lower and lower. In fact, it's dropping really low, so low that lots of things are not costing anything, gratis. They're good for PR. They're a complementary product. Now, a complementary product is, for example, if you run an airline, if you own an airline and go from here to Miami, Florida, you will sell more seats if the hotels in Miami lower their prices. From your point of view as an airline owner, the cost of hotels in Miami is a complementary product. From your point of view, if you're IBM and you're selling $20 billion a year worth of services, successful for a lawyer, isn't it? If you're selling $20 billion a year of services, from your point of view, the software is a complementary product. Now, people keep talking about commoditizing things, but it's much more useful to think in terms of saying, this is a complementary product, which if its price is lower, people can afford to spend more on what I can make money on. And that's a very strong motivator, especially for people who are accountants and people like that. So freedom from software says that you have to have a bunch of freedoms, and you also have an obligation. Your freedoms are to use, copy, study, modify, and redistribute. Now, most of you may not care about the studying and the modifying and the redistributing stuff. You only want to use and you want to copy so that you can get it, and then you want to use the software. But the point is, some of the software you use is going to be fixed or improved by somebody else. And they need those rules. So it works effectively as if everybody has the same rules, which is that you can use, copy, study, modify, and redistribute it. But you also have to have an obligation, which is the obligation that you pass on the rights you receive. That's what I said earlier, that if you don't have this obligation, it's like in the public domain, which means that the person you pass it on to can take away any of your rights and not give back any of the improvements he does. And it doesn't work. It's an evolutionarily unstable strategy, to use games theory language, which I don't want to talk about right here, but that's just in case anybody knows that. Now, I'm just going to mention patents briefly. Patents are the equivalent of copyright but applied to material objects. You patent how you do something. Except that nowadays patents are on mathematical areas or business practices. And so it gets a lot harder to invent around them than it used to be in the old days. In the old days it was actually quite possible. And patents that are expanding in their areas could cause lots of trouble. And so you have these big arguments like between IBM and Microsoft and whatnot. They're saying that they can destroy each other, and if you're rational, you won't destroy each other. If you're irrational, maybe you will. Now, I talked about the GNU General Public License, which was the software. There's also the Free Documentation License, which has invariant parts and changeable parts. And also, which I'm not going to talk about, provides a balance of monopoly and competition. You can say, for example, with the proceedings of the CALI conference, you can inquire that that be written on the cover if it's going to be printed. Now, from the point of view of a computer, a poem, a scientific paper, or an introduction is all the same. It's just bits. But from the point of view of a human, a poem and some software and some documentation about that software are all different. So you have to have different things. And some things you want to keep the same, except for making Faraday, for example. Nobody here wants to change Wordsworth's line, I saw a crowd, a host of daffodils. I haven't written down somewhere. But it's, you change it to a host of tulips. It doesn't sound right. Except as Faraday. You don't want to change that. And since you don't want to change it, you want to make that invariant and then have free use in your language. But you do want to change parts that you must change. So the free documentation has both. Now, think about textbooks and casebooks. At the moment, it's hard to customize them. It's hard to, for example, take what somebody wrote of just the laws and cases in Massachusetts and apply them to Illinois. And also, there are not very many incentives, whether reputational or otherwise, to contribute back unless you are a publisher or the author itself. So, what you need is a legal solution that permits you, and you need a technical solution. Now, for the technical solution, I want to come back to this single output, multiple outputs. In the old days, you had one kind of output, which was you printed things on paper. Before that, you carved things in stone. Nowadays, from one deep representation, you can get 4 outputs. You can get the printed typeset output, the output that is designed for printing on paper, which is how most of you think of things. You can have web pages, which is often slightly different. And web pages, though, are not really great for large documents, mainly because they don't know the difference between things that are internal to the document and things that are external. So you can't move around readily, and you can't search readily. And searching is a form of navigation. But info happens to be very good for that. And auditory, people who listen in cars, the situationally blind, who are going to be much more important than the permanently blind. It's also good for the permanently blind, and good for access and all that. But the one that's really going to blow up is when you listen to a novel, or listen to a legal case or whatever, as you're driving. You want to listen. You don't want people taking their eye off the road. And that's a biggie, and that's not often done. So as I said, the technical and legal problems have been solved. But the social problems have not been solved. Because, firstly, there's a personal habit. People tend to write for printed stuff. Even programmers, when they write documentation. And I've seen this. It's a real problem. And the second, of course, is a corporate aversion to different business models. It's often, from the point of view of a corporation, more profitable to spend $1 million, $10 million, or $100 million on lobbying to get a government than to enforce its laws, to change its laws, maybe and to enforce them against advances in technology, than to change its business habits. Now, some people have changed their business models, like IBM. It sells hardware, it sells services, but not everybody has done that. And so that's one of the things that makes current life interesting for lawyers and difficult for the rest of us. So, in conclusion, what I want to say is that your opportunities, especially if you're teaching law, depend on your legal rights to use, copy, study, modify, and redistribute. And your collaboration depends on your right to use your and others' work, which means you have to pass on, which becomes an obligation. And now I've done just about everything, and we can have questions. Oh, and I forgot to time you to ask me some questions, but maybe you can think of some.
Oh, yeah. I'll think of some questions.
Okay.
Question. It takes a few seconds to do.
Yes.
That's okay.
And I was actually very dense today. And I was not as funny as some of the other people are, but I was dense. Maybe.
Let me ask you one question.
Yes.
So, problem,
Mm-hmm.
I see the problem is not being that we're in a world now where we make money a certain way, let's say a corporation,
Mm-hmm.
and that there is another way, another business model. There's a transition to that.
It's a transition to that, for sure.
And in that transition, that's when you could lose everything.
Yes.
So,
You could lose everything. I mean, a good example is that in the early 1880s, the railroad companies in the United States were doing competitive bankruptcy, which meant that the owners of the railroad companies were losing everything they had. And that was really very bad for them. I mean, it might be good for others, it might not. I mean, it was hardware and it's took state. But it's a really awful way if you're trying to run a country to operate things. But so they invented a needful regulation, which in this case was the 1885 Interstate Commerce Commission law, to enable them to, in fact, what they did is they raised prices a little bit, but the people who were pure monopolists, who didn't have competitors, also had to lower them. So everybody thinks of it as a nice anti-capitalist mechanism because it meant in particular that farmers weren't ripped off as badly as it could be. So it went both ways. But the key point is that it was basically a way to prevent underpricing of competitors for a high initial, low incremental cost operation. Now we're running into the same thing again. That's what I'm saying. And we could lose. It could be that the United States is going to set up laws, and the United States has effective enough laws, like my electrical corporation actually hired a person, which is a real waste of my money, because I have to pay for my electrical bill, to prevent its engineers from taking work home, because they had a site license that didn't apply to engineers working off the site, right? And they wanted to hire somebody because it's cheaper for them to hire somebody at a cost to me than it is to be sued by, say, a disgruntled employee for breaking the law, or a disgruntled employee informs the copyright owner, the copyright owner sues them. It's cheaper, and so that's that's just a waste. That's just a waste of resources of any sort. But that's what happened, and we can have a lot of that. Now, one of the interesting things about the modern technology is that other countries, of course, may not follow this banning of technology, or this restriction or hindering of technology. It's not really a ban, it's hindering. And they may jump ahead of us, and so we may lose in another way. Yes?
What I'm hearing from you is the idea that we want this collaboration, we're really trying to build this collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Most people do, actually.
Well, when I look at the American society in particular, I don't see a sense of wanting to collaborate on much of anything. We're talking about, a society that's saying, we don't need people to pay taxes to support people who make less money,
You can say that, we can say that, but if you look at any corporation, any business, it means people are working together. They are collaborating. What people don't want to collaborate on are things where they think, my collaboration is going to be a waste of my resources. It's either a waste in terms of paying taxes, or it's a waste in terms of my paying too much of a price, or it's a waste because nobody's going to listen because it's washed away. And that's a different kind of issue. People actually like to work with other people and help other people, assuming that they get paid enough. And some do it for the fun of it and some don't. But the point is, from the point of view of you guys here, especially those who control funds, is that if you do any work here, the boring stuff you're going to have to pay people to do. I hate to say that, but it's true. I mean, when we created the GNU Linux system, we had to pay people to do the boring stuff. The interesting stuff and the small stuff, volunteers would be happy to do. But the boring stuff, like libraries, computer libraries, software libraries.
libraries are not boring.
Mm-hmm. Huh?
He's talking about computer libraries.
This is a metaphorical extension of the word library, and it makes sense to computer people, but doesn't make sense to anybody else. And what it really means is device drivers and things like that. Yes, it doesn't mean what I love libraries, physical libraries you walk into and all that. That's a great separate subject, and it's an accident of metaphor that I use that word.
But I guess what I'm seeing is if you're looking for some legislation that promotes collaboration.
Well, at the moment, you don't need the legislation to promote collaboration. We already have the old laws. That's what the legal solutions exist. We want to prevent people from taking away those laws, which is it would be nice also to have some more legislation. But you don't actually need it. That's one of the nice things about the United States, is we can work with what exists, as long as we're not hindered too much more. The main hindrances are social. They're not legal. In particular, the various GNU licenses and the invariant licenses already exist, already work with very traditional old law and Berne Convention stuff.
Yesterday, Weber said it's not that we want the government to level the playing field, but to keep the playing field existing.
Yeah.
I think that's the same idea.
I just see us moving the other direction.
Well, we are moving a lot in the other direction, and that needs to be, and that can only be stopped politically. But the one advantage of lawyers is that lawyers often have more influence on legislation than other people. It just happens that way, and it's a useful thing to think about. If you are in a law school, do you want to have a law school which says that you're going to bring up lawyers who are going to live in a country that is worse off than other countries, that hinders technical innovation? If you teach in law school, if you work in a library in law school, you're going to say, we're going to make much more hassle for me as a librarian, or we're going to make me the equivalent of a 19th century librarian. Do I want to be a 19th century librarian? Some people do, but not everybody. And people in law schools don't think that way. Yes, sorry, and then you...
Aren't you arguing that everything that's, I think the terminology is non-rivalrous,
Right.
should be open source and subject to something like a GNU license?
Yes, I've not argued that in the past, but it's coming closer. My experience in the past has been almost entirely with software, and documentation of software. But it's becoming more the case that since the non-rivalrous objects are becoming cheaper and basically informational non-rivalrous objects are becoming cheaper and cheaper to both create initially, and more important, their incremental cost, they should be under something equivalent to a GPL, GNU General Public License, or a documentation license. But that means then you have to figure out how you're going to fund the initial high cost, because even with a lower high cost, there's still initial high costs of various sorts.
So music,
like music, that means in particular that musicians, it can go a couple of different ways. One way is that musicians go back to being more like they were in the 1870s, when they made their living through getting patrons or through playing live music, concerts and such. And it's easier now to get patrons because you can have lots of middle-class people giving money as well as a few rich people. And people can do concerts. But if people don't go out, then they lose. But if people do go out, then you can have lots of concerts and lots of bars and whatever. And the point is, if you have lots of second-rate musicians, you'll have more first-rate musicians. And most musicians nowadays don't make money from the music. They work in the bars pouring liquor or whatever. What I'm saying is that they can then play, which may help them a little bit. It's still worthwhile paying a service to an editor to pick music for you. What's not worth necessarily doing is spending 8 or 10 times as much for an object that can carry that person's music to you, when you can find out, so the marketing gets done yourself or through somebody else on the internet. You can copy it and download it inexpensively, and you can make a copy or have a friend make a copy. That's where the price is. Now, I haven't gone into music much because I'm not much into music, but that's a clear side effect of that. But another good example is pharmaceuticals. At the moment, the way we fund pharmaceutical research and development is we raise the price in the United States, but not necessarily elsewhere, of certain drugs, so that the companies that do it are able to raise their price to pay for the high initial cost. The actual cost of a pill is actually quite low, of manufacturing a pill and distributing it and advertising and whatnot. Is actually quite low. And that's why we have what are called generic medicines. But it's clear that you don't want a single official committee deciding things, because that fails. We know that fails. We look at the Soviet Union, that fails. We actually don't even want 5 or 10 committees, official committees, funding high initial costs, because they may all have the same beliefs, and that doesn't work either. You really want like 100 or so different funding agencies working through universities, colleges, research labs, state research labs, whatever, funding the high initial stuff. And then you have to figure out a whole set of laws and administrative regulations and all that, which should be meat and potatoes for you guys, to handle that sort of thing. Because you have to have lots of independent funders. And the way we've done it so far is we've done the funding either through a single government or through raising the price of a particular topic and limiting who can get it. And that doesn't work. It just doesn't work terribly well. It works, but it doesn't work terribly well. And that's the issue. And this is an issue, by the way, that didn't really exist, except for law and military force, 200 years ago. 200 years ago, the prime high initial cost, low incremental cost activities were military action. If you created an army, it cost a lot of effort and time and money to create an army. But conquering your second city wasn't so expensive after you conquered your first. And the same thing with law. If you get a body of law going, it takes a lot of effort. It takes a legislature, it takes socialization, it takes a lot of effort. But once you've got it going, it doesn't take that much extra from a social society's point of view to keep it going. And interestingly enough, they both became government-sponsored high initial stuff. But we noticed with lawyers that lawyers are not paid for, except for public defenders, by a government agency. They're paid for by individuals. So you have the incremental cost, which is basically what lawyers are about, paid for incrementally, and lawyers still manage to make a lot of money, even though they have a freely redistributable stuff to distribute, to deal with. Okay, is that time? Thank you. Okay. Oh, I was going to show you the, we can go away, but the Emacs piece, I forgot about it all. Yeah. Yeah, you didn't make section 2. I just forgot about it. Oh, thank you.
/u/name-7-g.